you to start off with by, if you're not speaking, can I ask you to mute yourselves, and given the number of people we're going to have in on this call this afternoon or morning, depending where you are, to also turn off your audio visual link. We've got a lot of people joining today, and there's a risk that it might crash the system if we do this. First of all, as I say, welcome to this Business History Collective panel on slavery today. My name's Andrew Perchard at Northumbria University. I'm delighted to see everyone and so many people signed up for this panel. It promises to be a fascinating discussion today. We've got some wonderful speakers, and I'm very grateful to all of the panel members for giving their time today to talk. A few housekeeping rules. Dr. Nick Wong, who's on your screens there, will be the host for much of this. He will be moderating comments. If you have a question, please either virtually raise your hand or send through a comment on the chat function. Please, as I say, throughout the program, either mute yourself or, and if possible, take the audio visual off. So as soon as a person's spoken, we will you should revert back to muting and take yourself off that to ensure that things work smoothly. We've got a very tight program today. We're running for longer than we normally would because of this special panel. I've been asked to say a few additional words today about how this came about, and in some ways those are self-explanatory, although it's curious my providing the preamble, given that I'm not an early modern historian and I haven't written anything on slavery myself, but both as the editor of a journal that has had some interesting debates on the subject itself, History Workshop Journal, and as a historian generally, I'm fascinated in the very public debates that we've had around the question of slavery and indeed around monuments. So I'll quickly say something about where business history fits in with this, and I think that.
Oh shoot!
I think on two fronts we hope to address a number of questions in this. And first is, within business history generally, the relative lacuna of pieces writing about the early modern period, which I think we'd like to see addressed more, and I've spoken to a number of editors about this very question. And secondly is, particularly when we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum, to see some concerted scholarship published in business history journals on the transatlantic slave trade. So without further ado, thank you all again for joining us. I'd encourage you quickly as well to join us for some of our other sessions, and we've got a new program being developed too for the next year. So without further ado, I will mute and I will pass over to Professor Cheryl McWatters.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning if you're in North America. Thank you very much actually for the invitation to share this session. And I was really interested in the three papers. So my job right at the moment is essentially to set the stage for our three speakers. Many of you know them already, and so it's I'm not going to give a bio or anything here, but we have three papers, and first speaker will be Sherryllynne Haggerty, who from the University of Nottingham, who is going to speak about the making money in Jamaica in 1756, and the title, I'm so chained down by my business in this spot. Anyway, so I'm looking forward to that, and I had the opportunity to read the papers. So, I have some comments. I'm sure many others will as well. And the nice thing about this panel is that the papers are different in the topic. So our second paper is by Rafael Pardo, who's in the Faculty of Law at Emory University, who's going to talk about the bankruptcy and how building enslaving capacity in the antebellum administrative state. So we're really shifting from time period a bit, and also I guess the framing, we're going from Jamaica to what was going on in antebellum America. And our third paper by Stephen Mullen from the University of Glasgow is, I think, really topical in terms of how many of us are addressing issues of reconciliation and repatriation by looking at the University of Glasgow model of institutional slavery income. And I think giving some insights into that process at the University of Glasgow, what we might learn from it going forward at other institutions. So each speaker has been given a very short period of time, essentially 15 minutes. And I'm told that I have, even though I can't cut the mic, I will come back on to give you like a high sign 2 minutes. So when you see my face again, it's to tell you it's time to wrap up. So on that, I will it over to Sherryllynne.
Hey, can you hear me? Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Thank you very much, Andrew and Nick, for the invite and for arranging today's panel. So I'm going to read. I haven't got any nice slides or anything, so please bear with me. Okay, so when Gilbert Ford wrote in October 1756 that he was, quote, so chained down by my business, he was of course alluding, and without any irony, to the institution of slavery by which all free Jamaicans made their money, either explicitly or implicitly. Ford was a planter and one of the elite, and indeed the historiography of Jamaica, though vast, still tends to concentrate on the elite planters and merchants. Several of the excellent recent works continue in this vein. I see Trevor's in the audience. So here's with Garrigus' Plantation Machine, Krista Petley's White Fury, and Katie Donington's this year Bonza Family, all are in this vein. Even Daniel Luce's Children of Uncertain Fortune still deals with elite children of mixed heritage. Indeed, Christine Walker's Jamaica Ladies is a welcome rare insight into the contribution of women to Jamaica's economy, a group counted as lesser in a myriad of ways. Rarely do we see work that highlights the expense of living in Jamaica and the concomitant poverty of many whites, such as in the recent article by Trevor et al. However, a rare set of letters in the HCA prize papers at the National Archives UK, sent from Jamaica in autumn 1756, at the start of the 7 Years' War, facilitates the telling of stories of ordinary, everyday, but mostly white people. And I should note that the majority of the sources are from what Marissa Fuentes would call the traditional archives, and also comes from this particular year. This project is all just about 1756. So using these letters along with a range of sources such as accounts produce, manumission records, journals of the House of Assembly of Jamaica, mercantile collections, colonial office records, and a single wonderful find of the Jamaica current in this collection of letters, we can reconstruct at least some glimpses, of non-elite white lives. And so this paper asks, how did non-elite free people contribute to and benefit from the local, regional and Atlantic economy of Jamaica? I should say this comes from a wider project on Jamaica in 1766 about ordinary people. And I would like to say, because I am only talking really about white people today, I do have a chapter on enslaved people in the wider project. But today's paper comes from a chapter called Making Money. And in it, there are also sections on women and on lesser merchants. But today I'm going to concentrate on just some illustrative case studies on the 3 other sections, which are about ship's captains in Jamaica, working on the pen and plantation, and other occupations that supported slavery. So in true 18th century style, I have sort of double-barrel titles for each section. So this one is challenges facing ship's captains, or, quote, no dependence is to be put on what such fellows says. So captains needed to be industrious because of the range of duties they performed. Many acted as supercargo or agents for their principals, as well as ship's captains. So Andrew Hearsay Wilson of the Tsar of Muscovy wrote to his cousin in London, quote, you will excuse my not writing myself, for I am so hurried with business that I cannot find time. Not all crew were praiseworthy, however. Whilst Richard Watt noted that Captain White is the most industrious man and just the man for us, his mate Stinson is quite trash, have nothing to say to him. Now, Captain William Clutson, who's one of my favourite characters right from the beginning of the project, was of the Hope of Bristol, and he provides a good example of the difficulties of working in periods of war. He worked for Samuel Monkley of Bristol and had left Bristol around the 15th of March for Jamaica and had passed Barbados on his way. And his cargo was pretty typical of ships that were coming to sort with provisions. So it had loaf sugar, so those of you into mercantilism can have a grin about that, bacon, peas, grits, cheese, herrings, beef and pork, etc., which he sold through John and Edward Ford of Kingston. However, when he arrived in Jamaica, business did not proceed smoothly. His crew, according to the Fords, quote, being a parcel of drunk fellows, have all left him, his chief mate dead and his second mate a worthless scoundrel. It appears that Clutson's crew had signed up on a man of war, hoping to make some quick money from privateering, and the Fords continued that this had laid the captain under some difficulty, people being very hard to be got. Captain Clutson did eventually manage to get enough crew together, but it is clear that there was some doubt as to whether the crew would actually turn up, as the Fords noted that, quote, no dependence is to be put upon what such fellows says. Not all of Clutson's contacts were so understanding. Gerard Nash, a non-permanent factor in Jamaica, was scathing. On 8th of October, he complained to John Clark of Bristol that Captain Clutson has greatly disappointed me in regard to what he promised to take on board. He then wrote to the same day to John Reed, also of Bristol, that Clutson had, quote, shut me out and would take nothing on board for me, though he promised to give me the preference. Nash may not have known of Clutson's travails, but in several other letters, Nash used Clutson as an excuse for not sending payment in bills. So I think maybe he was using his excuse as a reason for why he hadn't made all his remittances. And Nash goes on in a very similar vein, complaining to various people about what's going on. So despite Nash's protestations, Clutson was clearly a good captain. He continued to work for the Monkleys throughout the 7 Years' War, was in Jamaica again in 1760, and was in fact still working for them in 1768 and 1773, although in his will he actually left very little. Okay, so section 2 is working on the pen and plantation, or, quote, you never saw an estate so murdered in all your life. Planter absenteeism meant that there was a demand for skilled planting attorneys in Jamaica. What planters needed were men prepared to do whatever it took to control enslaved men and women working in dreadful work and living environments. Quoting Trevor again there. However, overseers, bookkeepers and white artisans were transitory to the point of being nomadic. So and Thomas Ruffley in his Planter's Guide said that an overseer should be a man of settled, sober habits, presenting a gentleman-like appearance. But anyone who knows who's read anything about Fiscal knows that that was not always achieved. And that's perhaps hardly surprising given the disease, environment and living conditions. So, for example, one overseer that was fired was David Campbell. George Oldprest, who was an agent for Rose Fuller, wrote that Fuller would not make 40 hogsheads of sugar that year, 1756. Moreover, he added, quote, had I not gone up to the estate, he would have killed 40 slaves. You never saw an estate so murdered in your life. There was not a grain of corn in the house, nor a field, nor a plantain, nor a morsel of any other provision that a white person could put to his mouth. Notably, all press did not appear to express any concern for the plight of the enslaved. So the ideal for the overseer's house was that of an elevated site for maximum surveillance over the enslaved at work. But here we get another example of the ideal not being achieved. Following his visit to Jamaica in 1756, Caleb Dickinson of Bristol was able to report to John Hodges about his Lacovia plantation that a small house had been built for the overseer, consisting of, quote, a stall, a lodging room, a shade room, and it's as small as a plain as it could be made. Presumably, any new overseer was supposed to be grateful, as before this new build, quote, the overseer lodged over one of the curing houses in a loft and went to it up a ladder. Dickinson's absenteeism may also have been one of the reasons why it was reported that his gang of enslaved labour was so weak on the estate, and the fact that a friendly neighbour seemed to be advising on it. Caleb Dickinson himself also seemed perturbed to have lost the services of another Campbell, James, I don't know if they're related, who had worked as an overseer on pepper plantation. In November 1757, the next year, Dickinson wrote to James Campbell saying that he knew he could work for their family's interest if he would accept a job there again. Quite apart from avaricious attorneys and hapless overseers, it was not always easy to get good letter staff. Even wealthy men such as Edmund Hyde struggled to get artisans to work on his plantations. He wrote that he was in great need of a carpenter and a cooper and a wheelwright, each good at his profession, and left it to his correspondent, George Chandler, to pay whatever he thought would encourage them sufficiently. But actually, this was often not very much. Hyde, in fact, told Chandler that he was pleased with the work of a blue coat boy on his north side estate, Thomas Sole, and asked Chandler to find him another that is thoroughly master of his pen and bears the character of an honest, sober lad. And we see this in Liverpool as well, where blue coat boys are sent out supposedly to rescue them and give them a job, but treated quite badly. So the last section here, other occupations supporting slavery or irretrievable ruin and misery. So the busy capitalist island of Jamaica might have been dominated by sugar, but a vast range of other work was required to support wider Jamaican society. And these included lawyers, insurance underwriters, vending masters, tailors, shipwrights, tutors and tutoresses, artisans, and men such as the wonderfully named Gaywood Goad, the Kingston jailer. Not very hopeful about his prospects, in contrast, in autumn 1756, was William Turton Greer. Earlier in the year, in May, he'd advertised in the Jamaica Courant as an auctioneer or vendue master, and he had rented, quote, a large and commodious store on Harbour Street, and he advertised that he would be ready to start selling for others from the 1st of June, and thanked the many merchants who were supporting him. However, in October, he petitioned the House of Assembly for relief. It would appear that before setting up as a vendue master, he had settled on 20 acres of land, which was part of the deficiency laws benefits, and had applied himself industrially, so he said. He had grown cotton and other provisions with a small enslaved labour force. Several misfortunes, which he argued to the House of Assembly were, quote, not owing to his extravagance or neglect, meant that he had hardly made a sufficiency for himself or his family. And he further tried to add to his good character by stating that he had not received the weekly announcement the generality of new settlers were granted. And he petitioned for relief so that he could get title for his land, with which he must sell either, quote, which would sink him into irretrievable ruin and misery. And I think it's noteworthy that he was trying to sell his land to pay his debts rather than his small enslaved workforce, which he would, even without land, be able to rent out to provide an income, which is very common in Jamaica. Another recent arrival, writing home. Am I nearly done? 2 minutes. Okay, I shall leave him. Anyway, there's a carpenter who's writing home and he's managed to just turn up and get a job. I'll mention him in the conclusion. So to conclude about making money in Jamaica in 1756, it is clear that whilst Jamaica and Britain's richest colony had the highest per capita income, which was not equally distributed even amongst whites, Yet non-elite people did contribute to and benefit from the local regional transatlantic economy. However, things, as we've seen for William Clutson, were complicated by the start of the war, whether due to alter demand of closed markets or seamen deserting or getting drunk. A whole host of attorneys and overseers, etc., were required to help run the pens and plantations, but the wages and living conditions were not good enough to attract enough of them or of good quality to the colony. And men such as Eubank Ogle could change their plans and get an apprenticeship as a shipwright in Kingston on arrival, such was the demand. So non-elites made very important contributions to the economy, but were not so able to profit from their labours as were the elite. Many whites felt that they struggled financially, or at least presented themselves as such in order to survive, despite having many advantages over free people of colour, let alone the enslaved. All these people were in some way, ironically, chained down by their businesses, but not always successful financially. Of course, we do not have to feel sorry for them, nor should we, but their stories do help to complicate the dominant historiography on 18th century Jamaica by showing that not everyone got wealthy, but at the same time highlighting myriad ways in which even poor whites benefited from slavery. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Sherryllynne, and right on time. So that's thanks so much. And so now we're going to switch almost by a century and turn it over to Rafael Pardo from Emory, who's going to talk to us about the, I guess you'd say, the first bankruptcy legislation passed by Congress, I believe in 1841 in the US. And so Rafael, I believe you're going to share your screen with us.
I am. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Can folks see that? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So my paper consists of two parts. The first part builds on my prior work examining how the US government directly participated in the business of slavery through the 1841 Bankruptcy Act. I tell the story of the bankruptcy administration and sale of Banks Arcade, one of the premier commercial exchanges in New Orleans that played a prominent role in the slave trade. The second part of the paper discusses how this historical episode should influence our thinking about the role of US bankruptcy law in responding to the current financial crisis prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. For my presentation, I'll focus on the first part of the paper. I'll begin by placing the 1841 Bankruptcy Act in context. I'll then outline the legal arguments driving the story about the bankruptcy administration and sale of Banks Arcade. And the remainder of the presentation will focus on the story of the arcade. The US Constitution's 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was ratified on December 6, 1865. Accordingly, there are only two bankruptcy acts in US history that are contenders for studying the intersection between federal bankruptcy law and slavery, the 1800 Act and the 1841 Act. The 1841 Act is the forebear of modern US bankruptcy law. For the first time in the nation's history, it permitted debtors to voluntarily seek relief, in contrast to the 1800 Act, which only permitted creditors to initiate cases against debtors. Although the 1841 Act was quickly repealed, during that period of time, debtors flooded the bankruptcy system to take advantage of the legislation's generous relief. Over 45,000 cases were commenced, which starkly contrasts to the less than 1,000 cases under the 1800 Act. The following legal arguments drive my claim that the bankruptcy administration and sale of Banks Arcade demonstrate yet another significant way in which the federal government directly participated in the business of slavery pursuant to the 1841 Act. When a federal district court declared a debtor to be a bankrupt under the Act, a bankruptcy trust was created. The trust constituted a legal entity that acquired all of the debtor's property. This surrender of assets constituted the price paid by the bankrupt to receive a discharge of debts. The bankruptcy trust was administered by an assignee who was appointed, supervised, and controlled by the federal district court, and who was given the power to manage and liquidate the trust estate for the benefit of the bankrupt's creditors. Congress passed the 1841 Act to resuscitate the depressed national economy following the Panic of 1837. Importantly, the Act's goals were more than just about the resolution of private debt matters. They were about the national interest. On this front, consider a couple of statements by US senators in the debates over the Act. Senator Henry Clay from Kentucky said the following, quote, "I maintain that the public rights of the state are paramount to any supposed rights which appertain to a private creditor. This is the great principle which lies at the bottom of all bankrupt laws, and it is this which imposes upon Congress the duty of enacting a bankruptcy system. Senator William Fessenden from Maine said the following, quote, "Regard should always be had to the interests and rights of the citizens, but those rights and those interests must yield to high considerations of public policy. They must necessarily be made subservient to the good of the state. Legislation of this kind must be found upon higher views and more commanding principles which look to the general weal, to national objects. When these are brought into action, they necessarily ride over all these considerations, which affect individuals merely, and become imperative upon every statesman whose eye is single to the welfare of the whole country." In light of this and similar commentary, one can say that the Bankruptcy Trust was established and organized under federal law for the very purpose of pursuing federal governmental objectives under the direction and control of federal governmental appointees. All of these are indicia of a federal instrumentality. Finally, the Bankruptcy Trust was part of the antebellum federal administrative state. Congress delegated administration of the 1841 Act to the federal district courts, which gave them the opportunity to engage in residual policymaking, that is, filling gaps that existed in the statute. When exercising their residual policymaking authority, the federal district courts at times further increased the US government's direct involvement in the business of slavery, more so than in the absence of such policymaking. One of those instances involved the bankruptcy administration and sale of Banks Arcade. Banks Arcade was built in 1833 and was located in the American sector of New Orleans, just a couple of blocks away from Canal Street. The vertical green and red line bisecting the circle on the map is Canal Street, with the French Quarter to the right of the line and the American sector to the left. Zooming in on the map and rotating it so that the top points north, you can see the location of Banks Arcade on Magazine Street, running the entire block between Natchez and Gravier Streets. The arcade was near some of the city's other prominent exchanges involved in the slave trade, including the City Exchange at the St. Louis Hotel and the Exchange at the St. Charles Hotel. The arcade was also near the U.S. Custom House, which was home to the federal district court that administered the 1841 Act for the Eastern District of Louisiana. To give you a better sense of the lay of the land, here's a bird's eye view from the top of St. Patrick's Church looking north. And finally, here's a street level view of the arcade's front on Magazine Street. As previously mentioned, the arcade played a prominent role in the slave trade, and it did so well before its bankruptcy administration and sale. For example, consider this 1840 broadside announcing an auction of 17 enslaved persons by Joseph Beard and the corresponding auction notice from the Commercial Bulletin. By the end of the 1850s, Beard ended up being one of the most financially successful slave auctioneers in New Orleans. That said, like many of the Crescent City's elite entrepreneurs, Beard encountered financial distress after the Panic of 1837 and sought relief under the 1841 Act, filing his bankruptcy petition on March 8, 1842. Beard relocated his office to 45 Magazine Street 6 months after his bankruptcy filing. The office was in Banks Arcade, next to the arcade exchange room, which was where slave auctions in the arcade took place. As we'll see, the bankruptcy administration of Banks Arcade facilitated Beard's office relocation. Thomas Banks was among the other elite entrepreneurs in New Orleans who suffered financial distress. Like Beard, Banks sought to have his debts forgiven under the 1841 Act, filing his bankruptcy petition on July 30th, 1842, along with a schedule of his assets. Among the many assets owned by Banks was Banks Arcade, also known as the Arcade Exchange, which Banks valued at $350,000. The Eastern District's Federal District Court declared Banks a bankrupt on September 5th, 1842. Doing so created a bankruptcy trust pursuant to which the federal government became the owner of Banks Arcade, which would be managed by the trust's assignee, Francis B. Conrad, who was appointed by the court and was subject to its control and supervision. Pursuant to the act, the court required Conrad to execute a bond in the name of the United States to guard against any failure by Conrad to comply with his duties as assignee. The act permitted a court to set the bond amount, quote, in such sum as it may deem proper. The Eastern District's court set Conrad's bond for the eye-popping amount of $30,000. So far, I've documented the bond amount for 282 of the 763 cases filed in the Eastern District under the 1841 Act. For those cases, the median and mean amounts of the assignee's bond were respectively $50 and $1,100. The bond amount in Banks's case was the highest among the 282 cases, reflecting the significance and value of the assets involved in the case, including Banks Arcade. As Conrad began the work of marshalling and liquidating the estate's assets, the administration of Banks Arcade presented some challenges. Conrad petitioned the federal district court for approval to postpone the sale of certain real estate that had previously belonged to banks, including Banks Arcade, arguing, quote, that the establishments are of very great value and that if sold in block in the present embarrassed state of affairs, the sale would be attended with ruinous sacrifice. Conrad further sought permission to partition the real estate and lease the lots for a one-year term beginning on November 1st, 1842. While the 1841 Act gave assignees the power to sell, manage, and dispose of the bankruptcy trust's property, nowhere did it expressly authorize the lease of such property. Moreover, the Act mandated the following, quote, in order to ensure a speedy settlement and close of the proceedings in each case in bankruptcy, it shall be the duty of the court to order and direct the collection of the assets and a reduction of the same to money and a distribution thereof at as early periods as practicable. Nonetheless, the federal district court exercised its residual policymaking authority to approve Conrad's proposal. One of the subdivided lots in Banks Arcade was 45 Magazine Street, which Conrad leased to Joseph Beard for 1 year at the rate of $75 per month. Two of the other subdivided lots in Banks Arcade together consisted of the Arcade Exchange Room, where the arcade's slave auctions occurred. Conrad leased the entire room, that is both lots, for approximately 6 months. These actions had the effect of prolonging federal ownership of Banks Arcade, thereby further entrenching the US government in the business of slavery, as we will see. Ultimately, the federal district court scheduled the bankruptcy auction of these real estate holdings, including the arcade, to take place on February 15, 1843. The US Marshal conducted the sale, whose scope was massive. The sale notice on the front page of the New Orleans Bee occupied 2.5 columns. The notice announced that Banks Arcade had been partitioned into 21 lots, including lots 4 and 5, which together constituted the Arcade Exchange Room. The sale terms required winning bidders to make a cash down payment of 1/3 the purchase price, with the balance payable in 5 equal installments at 6-month intervals. Moreover, the purchase price balance would be secured by a mortgage on the property. As a result, the bankruptcy trust would assume the role of a secured creditor with respect to the purchased property, which would prolong the US government's involvement with that property. The US Marshal memorialized the results of the auction in his sales book of bankruptcy auctions. Those results point to the financial significance of the arcade sale to the bankruptcy trust. First, the sale of the 21 lots generated gross proceeds totaling $123,700. This amount represented only 35.3% of the value that Banks had listed for the arcade in his asset schedule. That said, the sale of the arcade generated a much better return relative to the Eastern District's average bankruptcy case involving an asset sale. In such a case, the gross proceeds generated from the sale of assets represented only 6.2% of their scheduled values. Finally, while the arcade's scheduled value represented only 1.1% of the scheduled value of all assets sold in the Eastern District's 1841 Act cases, the gross proceeds generated by the arcade sale constituted 6.3% of the aggregate gross proceeds from all of the district's 1841 Act bankruptcy sales. A significant amount of the proceeds from the sale of Banks Arcade came from the sale of the Arcade Exchange Room, which consisted of lots 4 and 5, with lot 5 constituting the bulk of the room. William Houston from London, England, purchased both lots. Lot 5 generated the most proceeds of any of the lots, $19,500. And the gross proceeds from the sale of the combined lots, that is $25,150, represented 1/5 of the total gross proceeds generated from the arcade sale. Taking a step back, we see that the bankruptcy trust in Banks's case owned the Arcade Exchange Room for 275 days, from September 5th, 1842, when the federal district court declared Banks a bankrupt, to June 7, 1843, when Conrad and Houston executed the act of sale, transferring ownership of the room from the federal government to Houston. And during a portion of this period of time, the bankruptcy trust leased the exchange room, receiving payments in return. Importantly, during this federal ownership period, a significant amount of financial activity directly involved in the business of slavery took place in the exchange room. During this period, there were at least 91 distinct notices in the Daily Picayune, the New Orleans Bee, and the New Orleans Commercial Bulletin announcing non-bankruptcy auctions of enslaved persons. Notably, 68% of these auctions were to be conducted by Joseph Beard, who had leased his office at 45 Magazine Street from the bank's bankruptcy trust. These auctions involved at least 449 enslaved individuals. Moreover, during this period, the U.S. Marshal conducted auctions of enslaved persons who had been owned and surrendered by Eastern District bankrupts pursuant to the 1841 Act. Those court-ordered bankruptcy auctions involved 74 enslaved individuals and generated gross sale proceeds of at least $13,950. Accordingly, during the 275-day period of federal ownership of the Arcade Exchange Room, at least 523 enslaved persons were likely to have been sold on the premises. Long after the bankruptcy administration and sale of the Exchange Room, the business of slavery continued there in robust fashion. For example, consider this 1856 broadside announcing an auction of 16 enslaved persons by Joseph Beard and the corresponding auction notice from the Daily Picayune. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that one of the primary locations of the slave trade in New Orleans and that one of the city's most successful slave auctioneers owed much of their financial rehabilitation to the bankruptcy benefits provided by the federal government pursuant to the 1841 Act. And on that note, I'd be remiss to end my presentation without mentioning the present-day status of Banks Arcade. What remains of the original building today is the St. James Hotel. In describing its history, the hotel makes no mention of the role of Banks Arcade in the business of slavery, instead trumpeting that it, quote, maintains the historical charm of a day gone by and pays homage to the romance, colors, and legends of New Orleans. The hotel's ignorance of or indifference to its past connections to slavery perpetuates what former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu described in his 2017 remarks addressing the removal of the city's Confederate monuments. That is, one story forgotten, or maybe even purposely ignored. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Rafael. That was really interesting, and I think there'll probably be lots of questions and comments after we hear from our third speaker. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Mullen, who is going to talk to us about the experience at the University of Glasgow. And hopefully we can still, we're doing great on the time here. So as again, I will give you the 2-minute signal there. And then thanks so much. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak. So I'm here to speak about the University of Glasgow institutional model of slavery income. It's now well known that on the 1st of August 2017, the University of Glasgow commissioned an unprecedented study to examine its historic relationship with transatlantic slavery. A year-long investigation, the report of September 2018, acknowledged the institution had benefited from wealth derived from chattel slavery, estimated between 16 million or up to 298 millions, depending on what estimation was used. The institution simultaneously launched what they described as a programme of reparative justice, which commits £20 million to a partnership with the University of the West Indies. So the unprecedented scale of both the evidence and the institutional response at Glasgow provided further impetus to what is now a national process of institutional reconciliation. In 2019 and 20 alone, the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Nottingham, Bristol and Aberdeen commissioned similar studies, some with permanent academic positions, to examine the connections with these institutions in slavery and or British colonialism. So of course I had an inside view of the Glasgow study. I was the principal researcher who systematically went through the university's records, looking to see how these merchants or planters or other profiteers from enslavement, as well as their descendants, how they contributed to the development of the institution. So today I'll focus on the model itself, as well as challenges for historians working in such studies, as well as issues with the methodology and potential transferability to other universities and institutions more broadly. By way of context, Scotland has had a long economic relationship with chattel slavery. Scots had limited direct involvement with the maritime trafficking in enslaved people from Scottish ports. However, chattel slavery profoundly influenced the development of the nation in other ways. As Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery makes clear, the profits of the slave trade were but one flow of capital. The Atlantic trades with North America and the Caribbean, as well as the personal fortunes of merchants, planters, and economic migrants known as sojourners, all contributed to British development. So in Scotland, the particular pattern is commerce based upon slave-grown imports, sugar, tobacco, and especially cotton, as well as the exports to the Americas, such as textiles, created private fortunes and also provided large-scale employment. So much so, historian T.M. Devine has concluded that slavery and its commerce influenced Scotland, which experienced rapid industrialisation despite a small population, in a more profound manner compared to England, Ireland or Wales. In other words, it was the Atlantic trades rather than the direct profits from the slave trade that powered Scotland's 18th and early 19th century economic growth. Despite this, the historiography of Atlantic slavery in British universities is in an embryonic state. Nicholas Draper's 2018 article, British Universities and Caribbean Slavery, is the only overview published so far, and it is of course based upon the evidence accumulated for the paradigm shifting legacies of British slave ownership project. This project has of course exposed the individuals who claimed compensation when slavery was abolished in the British West Indies in 1834. Draper suggests in his article that every British university extant in the 18th and early 19th century is likely to have received gifts derived from slavery. He also suggests 4 historic relationships should be of interest. Slave-owning founders and benefactors who bequeathed major sums, evidenced by Eric Williams's example of Codrington Library at All Souls, Oxford. Second of all, a British university may be an owner of enslaved people. Third, faculty members as slave owners. And 4, students and alumni as slave owners. As such, Draper's model of university slavery income is based upon evidence mainly relating to direct individuals in direct contact with the institution who were directly involved with slave ownership. Well, we can trace these type of relationships with the University of Glasgow study. The origins of Old College, which is now known as the University of Glasgow, can be traced to 1451, when the Bishop of Glasgow, William Turnbull, acquired a papal bull. So it was founded before the imposition of chattel slavery in the New World. So the early development of Old College was not influenced by chattel slavery, a 17th century phenomenon. And unlike many American universities, there's currently no evidence that Old College ever owned colonial plantations or enslaved people. However, what we will see is the biggest relationship was through benefactors post-1660. And also when the University of Glasgow relocates in 1870, wealth was donated to the institution. I was able to identify gifts, mortifications and bursaries donated to the university by individuals connected to colonial slavery, mercantile, planting and sojourning. They were clearly of some importance. I identified 16 bequests and gifts donated between 1697 and 1937. 3 were non-financial, such as books, scientific equipment, but of the 13 that were financial, some were donated directly, but others were held by external institutions. Of the 13, not all generated an annual income, but many did, and in the slavery period and beyond. As best as I can judge from incomplete data, the annual income from such endowments provided around 5 to 8% of the total endowment income in the later 19th and early 20th century. But there was another flow of capital. I mentioned that the University of Glasgow relocated in 1870 from the High Street to its Gilmore Hill campus. The relocation ultimately cost $428,000, and for an institution with an annual budget of $12,000 in the 1860s, this was a remarkable undertaking. Funding came from internal sources, British government grants, as well as public donations, which totalled $159,000 by 1876. So I went through some of the public donations and ascertained 23 individuals as having some form of connection to New World slavery, particularly through inherited wealth, and they donated around £11,000. I mean, this is a very small proportion of the overall sums, and it can be compared with the proportions identified in the preliminary work at the University of Bristol. In 2018, Richard Stone has estimated around 85% of the wealth used to fund Bristol University depended on the labour of enslaved people. I would say that I think Glasgow's total would increase with further research. The 23, it would be a matter of going through each person's inherited wealth and working backwards. I'll come on to that later. Overall, 40 donations, that is including bequests as well as to the capital campaign in 1870, I identified around 40 individual gifts. 30 of these were men identified. Only 16 of them, of this 30, are known to have matriculated at the University of Glasgow. Therefore, the university received more slavery-derived gifts with no prior connection to the institution than alumni. But assessing the main provenance of the overall wealth, mercantile planting or compensation money is a problematic task. My best estimates suggest that only a minority of the University of Glasgow's historic income from slavery can be traced to the compensation awarded in 1834, and that is somewhere between 13 and 18%. The majority of the Glasgow money came from tobacco and sugar merchants, both directly and also from wealth bequeathed to descendants. A slavery fortune does not begin and end in one generation, a conclusion that has obvious implications for other British institutions founded after slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean in 1834 and the United States in 1865. Indeed, over half of all the overall income came to the university from trust funds established by individuals whose only connection to slavery was via inheritance. In other words, only a minority of the income came from individuals identified as direct slave owners. This type of income, as Draper refers to, was only the tip of the iceberg. So we need to look beyond the model of income from direct slave owners to examine individuals with broader connections to the Atlantic economy, including inheritance. Challenges, issues, potential transferability. The major methodological issue is deciding what is a West India fortune or what is a slavery fortune. Some individuals had multiple sources of wealth. James Ewan, for example, was a West India merchant and planter in 19th century Glasgow, but he also had substantial industrial concerns. To me, slavery was the principal factor in his fortune and his main source of income. But I would say then, assessing the significance of slavery to trust funds or indeed inherited wealth is impossible. But the income that we established was treated as a slavery fortune, regardless of these issues. Another methodological assumption was that all of the identified total was income to the university. However, some of the monies, such as the trust funds, at least one trust fund held by the Merchant's House, was never held at any time by the university, that only received the interest. And also, I mean, the overwhelming use of the money was for student scholarships. I mean, I think perhaps some, even perhaps most, must have come back to the university in tuition fees. But what we are seeing is Old College was a direct beneficiary of the overall total. It was also a hub that facilitated the transmission of slavery wealth into the wider Glasgow economy. I think another issue, and it's less of a methodological issue, but merely how it was reported. We compared the income from slavery against price indexes, wage income, and a proportion of government expenditure. This allowed 3 separate modern estimates. The really superb website measuring worth supported this and allowed quantification of the 3 estimates, which 16 million, 67 million, and 198. I mean, these were often misunderstood, including by high-profile commentators. Charles Moore, for example, commented in the Telegraph, it has somehow been calculated that the slave-based value of their donations was worth in modern money anything between 16.7 million and 198 million, a range so great as to make the calculation almost meaningless. In fact, it was not a range at all. All three estimates are equally valid, and these should be explained in full in reports and by historians. Another issue is that the 200 million has become, the 198 million has become a favoured figure for the press, despite the lesser figures being equally valid. So my point is, the University of Glasgow monies started high and were reported in the highest possible fashion. Another challenge, of course, is the triple constraints. It was time, scope and cost impacting upon the quality of the scholarship. I'm fairly certain that the Glasgow study was comprehensive, but I also need to clarify I was coming at it with considerable expertise and experience in researching Scotland's colonial elites over a decade. We need to look in the identification of individuals, their slavery connections. Then there is the labour-intensive work of tracing bequests from inception up to present day. And on that point, I would say that perhaps the most challenging aspect was tracing bequests from the time of donation up to the modern period. Some of the bequests had been amalgamated as their terms became anachronistic, but some of them do remain as trust funds today within the university. The university archive tended to hold financial records up to 1982. History ended at that point. I then had to work with the finance office. I would say that conversations between historians in the 18th century British Atlantic world and modern accountants did not always proceed smoothly. I had names of slave owners and merchants. They had modern accounting information. I was asked at times if I had a budget code for funds. I had the names of slave owners. But after a process elimination, some of these historic bequests were matched by modern funds. Slavery has a budget code in British universities. Another aspect is, thank you. Another aspect is the work of historians. There has to be a visible separation from the corporate response, which some of these institutions, you know, the University of Glasgow has described it as reparative justice. The scholarship in which I'm trying to do, working on an article from the evidence, you know, the evidence is there and then the institution decides what they are doing and how they correct this relationship. And in this case, the university has been criticised for not consulting widely enough with communities of reparative interest, and it's also been criticised for raising and spending £20 million as opposed to providing this from core funds. My final point then is about potential transferability to other institutions. I would say most institutions with antecedents in the period of British slavery will be exposed to slavery in some way. The ancient universities, Cambridge and Aberdeen, have the benefit of identifying individuals and working forward, like Glasgow. Later 19th century institutions, Liverpool, Nottingham and Bristol, they need to identify individuals who donated after slavery was abolished and then work their way back. And in my experience, that was a much more difficult task. I think the model may also be applicable to schools who still hold bequests, with the caveats about what constitutes income. Philanthropic organisations, there's an issue there. Should monies they hold that are derived from slavery to be disbursed among wider society, should that be classed as income at all? They're merely facilitating the wealth into wider society. So as the case may be, slavery and its commerce, as we know, it not only powers the development of these institutions, but it also contributes to the economic and societal development of Great Britain more broadly. And these institutions are conduits to measure significance and scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so I've been given the role to offer some discussant comments. So I'll preface those comments to say that I'm not an expert on the topics themselves, and also when it comes to slavery, my context is the slave trade emanating from France. And as I often say to a colleague of mine who studies the UK, the English Channel or La Manche is a lot wider than you think when you are studying history, that you're not very far apart, but it seems worlds apart when you're looking at particular issues. So I just want to give some brief comments on the 3 papers, and then I'll turn it over to some of the comments that we may have received in the chat. So first of all, with respect to Sherryllynne's study of this Jamaica 1756, I just had a few comments on 3 things. First of all, the evidence that you are bringing to bear on your topic, I wasn't clear to me really from reading the paper exactly the role of these letters and how significant these letters were in the story. 1756 seemed to me an interesting and I would say difficult choice of a year. It's the start, as you know, to the 7 Years' War. I know in the French context, there's very little going on in the terms of the slave trade, and the slave economy was affected significantly. So I was wondering if, and prior to 1756, because most people involved were started to think about this war 2 or 3 years previous to its start. So I'm wondering if the year in question would not influence some of the things that you find. Specifically, when you're talking about the non-elite, I was expecting a slightly different story, and then ship captains, from my studies, are often people who are more on the elite side than the non-elite, given that most of them, if they did well, the idea was this was a way to move up the social ladder. So I just had a question about the evidence. Second of all, the choice of year, the influence of that. And really, when you are talking about these people being the non-elite and not well off, relative to whom exactly? Because I think that would be important, because relative to the enslaved people, no, relative to people in Britain, I was just maybe some comment on that. With respect to the second paper, actually by Rafael Pardo, about antebellum and the Bankruptcy Act, I have to say what really intrigued me about this study and the presentation was how it really reinforced to me the value of working with people in another discipline, which is sort of one of my pet talking points. But here we see someone from a faculty of law. And for many of us, it might be, wow, this is an introduction to something from a way that we may not have seen before or don't tend to read across the disciplines so much. That said, I did have a question about these individuals. And you talk about individuals, declaring bankruptcy and going through this process. But could you talk at all and perhaps have any information about the networks of credit behind those people? Because usually people who are involved in these business affairs, these contacts, are involved in quite a broad network. So you've brought it down to the individual, but I wonder if you could have any detail about who else they were networked with, who else did they owe money to, besides the fact that they themselves were in debt. And that was just a question I had because of, the whole role of networks in this type of trade. And you talk about enslaved people being, I guess you'd say, part of these processes. And was there any conflict there with other law that may have prohibited that type of sale going on? I'm not as familiar with the US situation, but the ability at this point to actually incorporate enslaved people in these proceedings. And the third, Stephen's presentation, I think challenges us as historians to think about, even though we tend to talk about not doing it, but what are the policy implications of our work? And Stephen shows us a challenge of someone who's working as an historian to uncover the evidence, to trace the sources of where this money or monies came from, the riches, perhaps of various institutions around the globe that came from nefarious activities. And then how do we separate that over time from what has come of those legacies? But then importantly, how do we separate that from the policy decisions that institutions, governments make to create some type of reparation, to deal with this legacy in a way that, I guess you say, meets the expectations of people in the present environment. I thought the efforts of trying to reconcile accounting and historians was that made me smile, being an accountant. But I think that there's the broader issue here is that the study brought forward evidence about the situation, possibilities on how much money, tracing where this money came from, some of it being, you said, invested funds, some of it being family wealth over generations. But then what do you do? And I think that the challenge for the university in terms of the money that they committed to invest and how was that decision made? And is that decision perhaps, also one that could be contested in today's environment? So I was given actually 15 minutes to speak, which was very, very generous because that was as much as the speakers were given. But I have been trying to monitor the chat, and I hopefully incorporated at least one or two of the questions in the chat in my own comments. But I just found this really, really interesting overall because the three papers were very different. And I think that it allows you as an historian to say, oh, well, there's something I would never have thought of. I would never have thought of looking at bankruptcy legislation as a way to get insights into the slave trade. This other paper, this whole process, I don't think many of us, or at least I wasn't aware of the huge process that went behind Stephen's work to bring this evidence to bear on what happened at the University of Glasgow and how we might take that into our own institutions. I live in Canada, so it's a different context, but we're dealing with whole issues of reconciliation, and also that people who gave money originally to some of our earliest universities received investment, received funding, received some of their own wealth from the slave trade. And then Sherryllynne's, I think, shows you the kind of value of getting deep and dirty into the archive, which some of us don't like to do. But I think trying to tease out of the letters and the evidence a broader story, and I guess some of the limitations of that in terms of what you can and cannot say because you only have the evidence that has been retained. And of course, we know as historians that what gets retained often is only a very small portion of the story. So on that, I will turn it over, and I'm not, to be honest, exactly clear how we're running the next stage in terms of this discussion, but if someone, I think if maybe Nick here can fill me in, but I'd ask the speakers maybe to come back on screen. So Rafael, Sherryllynne, and Stephen, if you could show us your faces and be on mic, that would be great.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Okay, so maybe if I could ask maybe each of the speakers to just take a minute or two to respond to my less than coherent comments, and I hope you could hear them because I find sometimes that Zoom, I can hear myself, but nobody else can hear me. So maybe in order or as you wish.
Okay, so all right for me to carry on, Nick?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, Cheryl, you gave me a wonderful invitation there, thinking about getting down and dirty in the archive, to answer in a nice way your first point about why 1756. So this was one of those moments for those of us that do like being in the archive, to have one of those eureka moments when you spent 2 hours going through 2 boxes wondering what the hell is all this, and then you realize after 2 hours, aha, and I was like, oh my god. So the reason for this, Cheryl, is that the letters, these were sent home on a British vessel. It was taken as a prize by the French and 2 days later retaken by the British. And so along with all the letters that the prize papers had from, for Dutch, French, Spanish papers, etc., we have very, very rarely one set of English letters because the post bag was not posted over, sent overboard. So in fact, so as we know, there are several other vessels that were taken, 6 or 7 other vessels were retaken by the British in the 7 Years' War. This is the only bag with letters for the whole of the 7 Years' War from Jamaica. So that's why 1756, it was complete just a find. And then I had to do history completely the wrong way around and go, now I've got to justify 1756, because as you quite rightly said, it is the start of the 7 Years' War. I think in terms of the choice of the year, it is really interesting, because for some of these people, so like Clutson, Captain Clutson, you know, the war makes his life more difficult. And I think the prices go up, and you know, provisions go up even more, etc., etc. I think for others, especially, you know, maybe the enslaved, of course, as prices go up, they might suffer too. But in a wider book, I want to say how actually, for ordinary people, life went on quite a lot as normal, actually, and the war. So there's loads of things about panicking in the letters about the French cruising the waters. But for a lot of people, life's going on as normal at the same time. So there's this strange sort of balance, really. In your second point about, you know, next to who are they poor? Well, they're much poorer than the elite planters, of course, and many of the people I'm talking about are actually even far poorer than elite people of colour, some of whom were formerly enslaved, if they'd been backed up by, you know, a white man, such as like, you know, Rose Fuller's ex-lover and others, for example. But actually, some of them, I left out the section on women. I did that mainly because it's very bitty because of the evidence. I'd love to have talked about the women here. Actually, some of what they left was lower than even what some enslaved people left. You know, like, so Rob McDonald talked about, you know, that some of them, that they rented themselves out and managed to earn so much money over a lifetime. Some of these women left less than that when they died. So it's a difficult story. So the enslaved people, Trevor's talked about this, the enslaved people were definitely the poorest in the British Empire, but some of the white people were poor as well. Don't necessarily feel sorry for them, but you know, you asked that question about that. And about the kind of, sorry, Nick, Wilshire, Clutson, yes, of course, some of the merchants, especially slave trade merchants, got very rich. But actually in his will, he left very little. He hadn't even bought his own house. He left a few paltry items of jewelry to his children, and some of his daughters were actually given second-hand clothes from his other children, which I know is quite normal, but it really was quite paltry. So not all of them are as successful as some of the slave trade captains, which we've talked about in our previous work. Thanks, Nick. Sorry.
Rafael, would you like to respond to Cheryl's comments?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your comments, Cheryl. So the first one regarded networks of credit, and here I'll try and be efficient. And I saw that in the chat there was a question from David Smith, somewhat related, so I'll try and tackle both of those at the same time. So yes, there were networks of credit involved, and they were quite significant. They were local, interstate, and international. The 1841 Bankruptcy Act allowed anyone who resided in any state, district, or territory of the US to potentially be eligible for relief. And the thing that's really important here is, whereas the states in the United States could pass debt forgiveness laws to forgive the debts of their citizens, they couldn't forgive debts that were owed between citizens of different states. And that's not a limitation that exists under the federal bankruptcy power. And so what you see in a lot of these cases is not only interstate debts, but also sometimes even international debts. And so I've written, and I know of this because as one of the requirements for eligibility for relief, you have to file a schedule of your liabilities, which I identified your creditors and their location, their residence. So I've been able to document these credit networks, and unfortunately I didn't have time to address it today in the paper, but you're 100% right. They're very important. And then your question regarding conflict with other laws. So here, because of the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause, in general, there were really no limitations on the federal government. Now, this is not to say that it wasn't the supremacy of the law wasn't contested, and it was very much so, including in a way very you know, that's very related to the paper that I presented. So one of the contested issues under the act was, what could the bankruptcy trust do with mortgaged property? did it have any right to take actions with it, or did it just have to let it pass through the bankruptcy process? And Banks Arcade was one of these mortgaged properties. And as you might imagine, enslaved persons who made their way into the bankruptcy process were also mortgaged. And so in the Eastern District of Louisiana, you had local officials like the Recorder of Mortgages resisting the orders of the federal district court saying, we're not going to go along with this. And some of this litigation making its way all the way up to the US Supreme Court. So in general, the law should not have conflicted, and whether it was the Louisiana Supreme Court or the US Supreme Court, they would all ultimately hold, no, the federal law was supreme, but that's not to say that the issue was not contested, and it very much was.
Thanks, Rafael. And Stephen?
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for your comments. And if I understand it, it's about the nature of the Glasgow decision making. And I think I can take on Andrew Smith's comments as well at the same time. So institutional influences. Well, what I would say, I mean, the initial question that was asked of the University of Glasgow about any historic income from slavery came from an organisation, Flag Up Scotland Jamaica, a part of organisation in Glasgow, and they asked a question: do the University of Glasgow hold any money from slave owners? So this was before I was employed as the researcher. Obviously, then the university commissioned the study. So in many ways, that response was lined up. There was a prima facie case, and then I came on board to undertake the research. And I should say, you know, as I mentioned in the talk, you know, I've been researching Glasgow West India merchants and Scots and across the Caribbean for over a decade. So I applied for the post, and it made sense. So in many ways, this model was already set up. Most of us knew there's a Ewing Prize that's publicised, there's a website. So the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project already highlighted this issue. So it just behoved me to identify the scale and the significance in these bequests. So I spent, you know, a year going through, and it became, we realised that the institution was much more exposed. The institution responded. You know, there was the £20 million figure. It's obviously a symbolic sum. It's the same figure that the British government provided in compensation in 1834, and it becomes educational reparative justice, if you like. I should say I had no involvement of the high level discussions. You know, I was the historian. I provided the evidence with my colleague, Professor Simon Newman, and this it's obviously been widely reported, well publicised, and they're the first institution in British history, you know, to make it in such a scale. I should say that Oxford All Souls have started the process with a scholarship a couple of years ago, and that's progressing. But I think it was just the institutional response at Glasgow was just so vast, you know, that's why it attracted the publicity. I'm not so sure I was expecting the global reception that it got, but it certainly did, and it's kicked off a wider process. And what I would say, I mean, Glasgow won't be unique.
If I can just hand over to Sherryllynne, who's best to get in.
I just wanted to add two points there. One is, Stephen, when you were talking about, you know, the tobacco and the sugar, the thing that's come up with Nottingham, of course, is cotton.
Yeah.
And that links us then with, you know, Brazil as well into the 19th century, etc. So I thought that was a really good point, and one that we're struggling to make. But we're not struggling to make the connections, but like you, how much of that value is, you know, goes into the university.
Absolutely. Parameters of the study was 1865, but there's a work of Joe Mulhern has recently been flagging up about British involvement in Brazil, who of course abolished slavery much later. This is uncharted territory.
Yeah.
And Joe's work has shown, you know, the exposure to Scottish British banks. So these questions will be moving forward.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
can I also make a point, which is actually why I asked to speak, sorry, Nick, to Andrew Smith's thing about jumping on the bandwagon. And I think there is an element of this. And, you know, there's in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, so what happens here is you've got people in charge of the project that don't know anything to do with the history or the politics around it. Black Lives Matter movement, you know, the leader of the project at Nottingham wanted to make a big announcement. We're going to change the name of a building. And, you know, it was really hard to hold him back and go, hey, you need to, exactly what you told us before, you know, and Simon, you and Nick, you need to consult with the affected communities about before you do this. So there's a lot of people thinking they're doing a lot of good, that actually it's very politically sensitive. And it leaves people like you and I and the PDRAs are in a very difficult position where, you know, they want to get these political points from these things, but they're in danger of doing exactly the opposite because they don't always consult with the historians or the people, especially that are working in public engagement.
Yeah, I mean, and the communities are a part of interest, you know, there should be wide consultation. So there's absolutely a reputational consequences and PR issues for institutions, there's no doubt. And then after the summer of 2020 with Black Lives Matter, this conversation, we're moving into an imperial aware age in Great Britain, where a story like a benefactor with slavery connections becomes a bad news story, and some institutions might want to preempt that, but I would always bring it back. These should be evidence-led strategies and wider consultation.
I'm muting myself. So questions are being building up in the chat. So if I can just move on to these very quickly, I will read them out because some people have had to leave the discussion now. But Jennifer Perchard, sorry if I said it wrong. She asked Rafa, let's have a look. What would the federal officials do if they discovered the enslaved person was kidnapped in Africa? The 808 US law prohibit the importation of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the US from any foreign kingdom, place or country.
So it's a fantastic question. I've not yet come across a case where that happened, but what I can suspect, and for sure I'm going to be looking out for this sort of activity in the evidence in the archives to see if any of that comes up. But what I can tell you is the assignees, their compensation was based on how much they distributed from the bankruptcy process, and so they had an economic incentive to try and keep any property within the estate. And so there are instances of, for example, debtors who on the eve of bankruptcy would transfer their the enslaved persons they own to third parties, and then the bankruptcy assignee would go after those enslaved persons, in essence, a deputized fugitive slave catcher, and to bring them back into the estate so that they could be sold and the proceeds then distributed. And so I would anticipate that in an instance like Jennifer identifies, I would imagine that the assignee would contest that very much so.
Let me check again.
Okay. Right, sorry, I can't keep up with the chat and the questions at the same time, but David Smith asked you a question, Rafa. I know that you addressed this in your chat at the end. Do you have anything to add about the relief that was sought under the 1841 Act?
Well, you would need to say Andrew's comment could be characterised as cynical, but certainly you would need to say that there has been movement. I mean, this is about black activism. We shouldn't forget that these, the importance of black-led initiative here, and certainly that was the case at Glasgow. You know, a reparative justice organisation, Flag Up Scotland Jamaica, asked a question. The university had to respond. So it wasn't some cynical PR attempt to just emulate Yale or Georgetown. What I would say, of course, we read these studies whilst we were doing the report. They certainly influenced our approaches. But at the outset, I mean, this was a black-led organisation that asked the question.
Thanks, Stephen. Sorry, this is the question to the Rafael from David Smith about the seeking relief under the 1841 Act. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think I covered it in my response to Cheryl the question that he asked, but I'm happy to follow.
Sorry, I was missing this. Probably trying to flick through the comments. What about Hilary Claggett's question about the Bankruptcy Act of 1841? Did the Bankruptcy Act of 1841 end the debtors' prisons or change anything about the way debtors' prisons functions? In a recent biography of Eliza Hamilton, the author mentioned that many people were imprisoned for very small debts. The prisons also housed formerly wealthy people who had lost their fortunes in the war or through gambling, for example.
So in the early 1800s and leading up through the antebellum period, more and more states were abolishing debtors' prison, and it was a state issue. Although a contested legal issue under the 1841 Act was what effect, if any, did seeking relief under the Act have on the ability to be released from debtors' prison. And some federal courts took the view that once a debtor began a case, they had to be released. Others took the view it's not until the discharge was granted that they had to be released. So that was very much a contested legal issue during the administration of the Act.
Excellent. And another question from Jennifer Birches to Stephen this time. When the gifts were made at the time, did anyone bring up the issue of blood money? Did the university ever reject gifts? And is the University of Glasgow offering any reparations to the communities who were harmed?
Well, I'll take the first point. No, is the short answer. You know, the University of Glasgow has prided itself in being, you know, a centre of abolitionist critique. You know, Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, John Miller, they were writing philosophical critiques of chattel slavery in different ways, moral and economic. But it seems to me, and in the work I'm doing, the paper I'm just about to publish, I'm arguing that the university was actually, the institution was pro-slavery in practice, because it takes these gifts, and in fact courts gifts at times, it writes to famous alumni saying, you know, we're aware of your achievements, their imperial governors in Virginia, for example, and saying, we're aware of your achievements, we'll award you a doctorate, and in response they're receiving gifts. So they courted individuals with high status. There is no qualms about courting money from individuals with connections to slavery, including James Ewing, who's the leader of the de facto leader of the Glasgow West India interest. The Glasgow awards him a doctorate, and they take £100 in response. There are no problems taking this money. I would wonder. I would like to hear, if it's possible, wonder what Adam Smith would have thought of it. Or I don't think Smith was an abolitionist. But Francis Hutcheson might have been a better example. I would like to. He was morally opposed, and John Miller. You'll probably never find that correspondence. The second point, the university have committed £20 million to a partnership with the University of West Indies. There is criticisms that the university have committed to raise and spend funds as opposed to providing it from its core monies. And at the same time, you know, it's through the University of West Indies, so the criticisms have been that it's of limited reach. But I would say it's reparative justice as it's described, as opposed to reparations as such.
Cheers, Stephen.
Thank
Another
you.
question for Rafael. Popular paper, Rafael. This is from Caitlin Rosenthal. Can you please tell us a bit more about how important this story and the 1841 Act in general was important in the emergence of bankruptcy law more generally? You alluded to this in the other half of the paper, and I'd love to hear the big picture. Thank you.
So there are kind of two approaches to answering this question. One is, of course, at a micro level, so much of what was happening in the 1841 Act was experimenting with a new way of dealing with bankruptcy as a process, and that created the framework for future bankruptcy acts. So issues such as leasing trust property, or canceling mortgages and selling property free of a mortgage. All of those are provisions that exist in today's bankruptcy law that did not exist back in 1841, but nonetheless the courts experimented. So that's on the micro level. On the macro level, there is a debate with modern bankruptcy law as to whether it is a matter of private debt resolution, or rather, is this process that implicates the public interest. And what I think that my work helps show is that if we do think it is about the public interest, and of course I think it's about the public interest, these historical lessons should be a wake-up call for us when we administer bankruptcy law today. So by way of example, if you believe that the government was the owner of bankrupt assets, by way of example, Remington Arms, the gun manufacturer in the US, went through Chapter 11. They manufactured the AR-15 that was used in the Sandy Hook killings of children. How are we going to feel 100 years from now when we think about what the federal government's involvement was in helping restructure companies that are involved in horrific acts? So this all comes back to what is very much a contested debate. Is this about the public interest, or is it just about private debt matters? And I hope that my work can contribute to that debate and sort of seeing the through line.
Thanks, Rafael. Stephen, another question for you. How do we reconcile the financial and non-financial research in these projects? For example, can we calculate the harm done by universities in spreading racialized ideas that were developed under slavery, and how have you incorporated these into the Glasgow project?
It's an interesting point about the spread of racial ideas, but it seems to me Glasgow, I mean, that would have been included in the study, I think, if I had found, you know, pro-slavery advocates, you know, philosophers. But it seems to me Glasgow seems to be the paradox, and that it prided itself as an abolitionist centre, and at the same time, now we know, was taking slavery income. There's certainly an issue here. The gifts were coming for the expropriation of black and slave labour, taken by white planters, merchants, given to a white institution, and then used, as far as I can see, almost exclusively for white students. So there's an issue that's perpetuating, you know, white supremacist society. You know, it's definitely perpetuating and maintaining. But I'm not aware that, you know, Glasgow University had these philosophers that promoted the racial idea. Maybe there is, it's just not my area of expertise. But reconciling financial and non-financial gifts, certainly you can put a figure, you can put a number on the financial, but the non-financial was I mean, it's impossible to quantify. But what I would need to say, and certainly with the McFarlane instruments, they were amongst the best in Europe. They were comparable to Greenwich's instruments. This led to the establishment of the McFarlane Observatory at Glasgow in 1760. I mean, it get considerable expertise coming from a Jamaican planter, Alexander McFarlane. And then there's incredible intellectual capital coming from that for the institution. I mean, it's impossible to quantify, but certainly it had a major effect. And, you know, the development of the institution, there's book collections, and, you know, how do you measure? And I think this is a wider issue. We were very keen to incorporate the non-financial gifts with the financial. You can put a number in one, much more difficult to do it with the other. But what I will say, we now know, although the university prides itself as abolitionist, the other side of the story is incredibly well known now.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, that brings us absolutely lovely to the last minute of our webinar. So if I can stand over to Andrew to wrap up. Andrew Perchard, sorry.
Thanks, Nick. Can I thank all of the presenters for a wonderful panel? It was very stimulating, really fantastic. And to Cheryl McWatters for her great sharing of the session. Can I just thank everyone else for attending as well, and remind everyone that our next seminar is on the 18th of November, if you wish to attend that. You can follow our updates on Twitter, on BizHizCall, and we have a blog as well, Business History Collective, so you can find more details out about our forthcoming programme as well. So my thanks again to everyone, wonderful panel, and I hope you all have a nice evening or the rest of the day. Thank you.